If you have played some or all of the iterations of Call of Duty Zombies, you will have noticed that each installment brings in new movement mechanics or changes to existing movement systems in an effort to improve the overall gameplay experience for the player. In playing some of the older Treyarch Zombies titles, I became very interested in seeing how movement mechanics have evolved from game to game. As such, this video is the first of a series in which I take a deep dive into movement mechanics throughout the Zombies mode in Call of Duty games specifically developed by Treyarch. While I do not currently plan on looking at the Zombies modes from games produced by Infinity Ward or Sledgehammer, I may eventually come around to those games sometime in the future. But for now, let's jump back to the game that started it all, Call of Duty World at War. Since World at War is the first game to feature zombies and the first Treyarch Call of Duty game produced after COD 4's success, its movement mechanics are understandably very basic and somewhat unpolished for today's standards. The complete list of movement options in this game are as follows: crawling while prone, walking while crouched, walking while aiming down sight while crouched, walking while standing up, walking while aiming down sight while standing up, sprinting while standing up, and jumping while standing up. For the Zombies mode, I decided to look into the mechanics behind all of these except walking and aiming down sight while crouched and jumping while standing up. There are already only a handful of scenarios where the player is forced into crouching in the Zombies mode throughout the COD franchise. Therefore, I feel like there are even fewer instances where the player would actively choose to aim down sight and walk while crouched rather than just standing and doing so. For that reason, I decided not to look into that mechanic. As for jumping, I admit that jumping is extremely useful in the Zombies mode, especially when it comes to things like strafe jumping and when you're trying to train a horde of zombies. However, the jump mechanics are quite difficult to quantitatively measure and observe through just raw gameplay. For that reason, I decided not to analyze them in depth. More of a qualitative overview of these mechanics would be that, from my experience, I would say that jumping simply appears to maintain your ground speed while in midair for most scenarios. For the mechanics I decided to analyze, I wanted to quickly go over how I went about collecting data. Each mechanic is affected by the player's equipped weapon, so once I obtained a weapon I wanted to use for a test, I would then go to a certain region of a map and travel across a specific area with that weapon 3 to 5 times. Since I recorded nearly all of my tests in 60 frames per second, I would then open the recordings in my editing software to identify the first frame where movement starts and the first frame where movement ends. So I would have, usually on these measurements, approximately an error of 1 to 2 frames, being 1/60th to 1/30th of a second. By subtracting the start time I had recorded from the end time I had recorded, I was then able to calculate the time it took to travel a specific distance with a specific weapon for a specific movement mechanic. I would then do the same analysis for each of the 3 to 5 tests per weapon to calculate an average value, which would then be used to calculate a relative movement speed as a percentage. So the relative movement speed compares the time it took to travel a specific distance to some reference value. The most common reference speed I have seen used when comparing movement speeds is the player walking speed while holding a pistol. As a result, I chose to compare all data to the time it took for the player to travel the same distance while holding their starting weapon, the Colt M1911. Simply put, calculated movement speeds that you see are greater than 100% indicate that the movement speeds are faster than walking with the M1911, while movement speeds which are less than 100% indicate that the movement speeds are speeds that are actually slower than walking with the M1911. I have created a document in Google Sheets which shows all of the calculated values and movement speeds, which is linked in the description. Additionally, I will publish separate videos with all of the test footage if you would like to check out the data for yourself, or would like more information on my testing methods, assumptions, and conclusions I drew from the data. Since walking speed with the M1911 is the reference speed, the first movement mechanic I will discuss is player walking speed. When gathering data, I tested the movement speeds for all non-wonder weapons available on Nacht der Untoten. From the data, I was able to identify 4 well-defined movement tiers for walking speeds. The 4 tiers are the fast tier, average tier, slow tier, and very slow tier. Weapons within the fast tier include the M1911, all SMGs, all shotguns, the BAR, and the STG-44, which all sport 100% movement speed while walking. Weapons within the average tier include the 357 Magnum and all rifles excluding the STG-44. These weapons have 90% movement speed while walking. Weapons within the slow tier include the FG-42 and the M2 Flamethrower, which have 80% movement speed while walking. And then finally, the weapons within the very slow tier include the PTRS, all the MGs, and the Panzerschreck. These weapons have 75% movement speed while walking. For the most part, these results make sense, with the only real surprises being the fast movement speeds of the BAR and STG-44. When it comes to the BAR, compared to the other LMGs and big MGs, the BAR has significantly less ammo and a smaller magazine size, so I suppose that the increased movement speed was used as a balancing tool to give it some advantage over those weapons. However, when we look at the STG-44, we can see that it has actually similar damage to other weapons in the rifle class, while supporting a higher ammo count, a larger magazine size, and full auto fire. So it is quite curious that its mobility is on par with the SMGs. I suspect that this is because mobility data is taken from multiplayer and campaign, where the STG is actually a lower damage rifle which features increased movement as a balancing tool to make it seem on par with the higher damage rifles like the M1 Garand, the M1 Carbine, the SVT-40, and the Gewehr. Moving on to sprint speeds, I tested the movement speeds for one weapon of each weapon class. The pistol I tested was the M1911, the SMG I tested was the Thompson, the shotgun I tested was the sawed-off double-barrel shotgun with grip, the rifle I tested was the M1A1 Carbine, the LMG that I tested was the FG-42, the MG I tested was the MG-42, and then I also tested the PTRS and the Panzerschreck. For each weapon, I found that the sprint speed calculated was greater than its corresponding walking speed by a multiplier of 1.5. This would indicate that sprinting takes the player's walking speed and boosts it by 50% as a multiplier. Whenever I'm talking about percentages, always assume that I am talking about a multiplier rather than an additive factor. So, for example, when I say sprint speed boosts your speed by 50%, if the player has 80% movement speed with a specific weapon, boosting by 50% means multiplying by 1.5, which would give you 120%, rather than adding 50 to 80, which gives you 130%. Long story short, just don't assume that it's an additive percentage unless I tell you otherwise. So if you look at the test footage for sprint speeds, you will notice that I changed the route I used to measure sprint speeds for the weapons which have walking speeds which are less than or equal to 80%. This is because in the initial route I was using, their sprint duration wears off before I could complete the route. When the player sprints in World at War, they can only sprint for a certain period of time. After the time expires, they must walk or stand still to recharge their sprint duration. In World at War, sprint duration is actually directly linked to the weapon equipped by the player. From my testing, I was able to conclude that sprint duration varies according to these rules. Pistols have the longest sprint duration at max charge, with a sprint duration of 4.8 seconds. SMGs, shotguns, and rifles have a sprint duration of 4 seconds at max charge. Finally, the PTRS, all LMGs, all MGs, the Panzerschreck, and the Flamethrower only have 3 seconds of sprint at max charge. Essentially what this means is pistols have the longest sprint duration, and weapons with walking speeds less than or equal to 80% have the shortest sprint durations. All other weapons have a 4-second sprint duration when fully charged. I found this to be quite interesting, because heavier weapons are even further discouraged beyond their slow walking speeds. Like sprint speeds, I tested player movement when walking while crouched with one weapon per weapon class, using actually the same weapons that I listed for my sprint speed testing. The results of these tests indicated that the player moves at a speed that is roughly 66% of their walking speed, taking into account, of course, the weapon equipped in their hands. As such, to get your crouch walking speed with a certain weapon, you take your walking speed with that weapon and multiply it by a factor of 0.66. When it comes to your crawl speed, I only tested the M1911 and the M2 flamethrower. I'd initially debated even testing this because crawling is nearly useless in every game due to the extremely low movement speed, but I caved and decided to at least get 2 data points just to see if there was anything weird going on. However, all that I really found is that it's very similar to crouch walking, except instead of a factor of 0.66, it's a factor of 0.15. So with the pistol, the M1911, you move at 15% movement speed, and with the M2 flamethrower, you move at 12% movement speed. And finally, we have come to the most complex data set from Call of Duty World at War, which is walking while aiming down sight, or ADS. Generally, I like to refer to this as strafing, so if you hear me say strafe speed, know that it is the same as aiming down sight while walking. Since this dataset was so complex, I tested at least 2 weapons from each weapon class to get a better idea of how strafing works, since many weapons will have actually unique multipliers or unique speeds. Upon analyzing the data, I found 2 ways to organize the results. The first is a tier system based on strafe speeds, similar to the walking speed tier system that I presented earlier. The second system is a list based on the multiplier applied to the weapon walking speed. When presenting the data in a tier list format, I identified 9 tiers of strafing movement speed, and they are as follows. The first tier is the extremely fast tier, then the very fast tier, the fast tier, the above average tier, the average tier, the below average tier, the slow tier, the very slow tier, and the extremely slow tier. The only weapon in the extremely fast tier is the M1911, which has 60% movement speed while strafing. The weapons in the very fast tier are the SMGs and the STG-44, which have 52% movement speed while strafing. The weapons in the fast tier are the shotguns and the 357 Magnum, which all have 50% movement speed while strafing. The weapons in the above average tier are the rifles, excluding the STG-44. The rifles all have 37% movement speed while strafing. The only weapon in the average tier is the BAR, which has 35% movement speed while strafing. The only weapon in the below average tier is the FG-42, which has 33% movement speed while strafing. The weapons in the slow tier are the MGs and the PTRS. They have 31% movement speed while strafing. The only weapon in the very slow tier is the M2 flamethrower, which has 29% movement speed while strafing. And then finally, the only weapon in the extremely slow tier is the Panzerschreck, which has 25% movement speed while strafing. When organizing this data by the multiplier applied to the weapon's walking speed, the walking speed for the M1911 is affected by a 0.6 multiplier. The walking speed for the Magnum is affected by a 0.55 multiplier. The SMGs and the STG-44 are affected by a 0.52 multiplier. Shotguns are affected by a 0.50 multiplier. The rifles, the FG-42, the MGs, and the PTRS are all affected by a 0.40 multiplier. and then the BAR, Panzerschreck, and M2 Flamethrower are affected by a 0.35 multiplier. Normally when I look at data that only varies by 1%, I generally write that off as a measurement error or some kind of systemic error dealing with how data was recorded. However, I am very confident that when you see differences like 35% to 33% to 31% to 29%, which are only each separated by 2%, I'm very confident that those are actually separate tiers, because when you look at the data, the actual measured times, it's almost a second difference between some of those tiers. So I'm very confident that those are each separate tiers and not just random error or systemic error. Despite how you organize the data, I believe everything that's listed here somewhat makes sense. It makes sense that LMGs and heavy weapons have slower strafe speeds than the SMGs and the pistols and the shotguns. As with the results for walking speed, the STG-44 is treated like an SMG. The BAR, on the other hand, is demoted below the rifles because it has a multiplier which is tied for worst with the Panzerschreck and the Flamethrower, being 0.35. All in all, World at War laid a decent foundation for the games to follow. Over the course of the next few videos, we will see this foundation restructured and expanded upon, as well as an increase in complexity as weapon attachments, new perks, and new movement mechanics are introduced. I look forward to continuing this series for you guys and exposing more interesting information about the mechanics of these games which I enjoy playing. If you, the viewer, found this video helpful or at the very least interesting, I would really appreciate a like, comment, and/or subscribe. I want this channel to be an outlet for more highly edited content or post-commentary videos like this one, so any feedback on the editing of this video or the content itself would be greatly appreciated. I also stream on Twitch at twitch.tv/spknhn, usually every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, starting at around 8 or 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you're interested in more live commentary or gameplay style content, feel free to go check that out, as well as maybe give me a follow. Anyway, if you're still here, thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. I really appreciate it. Have a nice day, you guys, and I'll see you around.